If any of the panelists want to respond to anything that the others have said, then so then we're open for questions from students.
Pura case, and this was in fact a very it was a sad day when you have a press council team say that this was part of propaganda and the women lied, that they were giggling, therefore they were lying about rape, etc., etc. But I remember after this, the report came out, there was a big meeting at Press Club of India, massive, which was, I mean, I must give B.G. Varghese credit, I mean, that he came to face. And that meeting went on for several hours. The women's groups had invited him, and that was the last time there was such an exchange that took place. It was a good meeting, but he stuck to his position. He refused to budge from it. Now the tragedy with that case is that you have official reports from the division, from the deputy commissioner, which authenticates, because he was the first official to visit, which authenticated and said, he questioned the number of women who were raped, yes, no doubt, but he did not question the fact that a rape had taken place. There was a senior divisional commissioner of Kashmir, then became the chairperson of the RTI and then the chairperson of National Minorities Commission, Wajahat Habibullah, who's again very sad that he also denied the report that his junior had filed and questioned the veracity of that. That case has taken 26 years. 26 years, and you know where it is stuck? It is stuck in Supreme Court over an insignificant issue. I consider it an insignificant issue of compensation, not the crime itself. And the army is challenging even this payment of compensation. Now 26 years, you can't establish truth, you don't have, nobody says much, it hasn't been reported very widely. A book has come out, and an excellent book which Zuban has brought out, but not much, there is not much concern about it. So we have to ask ourselves, what is our commitment to freedom? What is our commitment? I mean, we talk about big abstract things, but what do we really mean if we cannot even understand, empathize with, and stand up for our own fellow citizens? That is the question for me.
And the other on the duty of the press vis-a-vis the freedom of the press. So, insofar as the Kashmir issue is concerned, one of the strands is that it's a self-serving purpose to have the dominant that citizens of the country should have as anyone else in any other state, this would solve or be a step forward in the purpose. So my first question in regards to the Kashmir issue is, do you see this switch in narrative possible?
more questions? Should we select them and then try and see if the panelists want to address them together? Yes, please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah. We'll start with Anandita, right at the top. Whoa.
No?
Yeah, the mic is here.
I had two.
We have a request. Can you all please introduce yourself and then ask the question?
Hi, I'm Anindita. I studied here a while ago. I had two questions, kind of distinct. So if that's all right, yeah. One was related to this question of the duties that come associated with the freedom. One part of why we do not have pre-censorship is the idea that the press in India self-regulates. At Nalsar, we've had a couple of run-ins with the way in which the press, or at least the television media self-regulates in this country. One in
Hello, my name is Mehul and I study here. So my question was actually related to what Anindita said, especially about self-regulation. My point is it practicable for us, for the media here, to have a system of self-regulation, particularly in a marketplace where the balance of power, especially because all of you talked about how some forms of censorship come from within. Some media houses ask for other newspapers or other anchors or other people to be censored. So do you think self-regulation is a good idea, considering that the balance of power inside the particular industry is so very lopsided, particularly in case of independent publications vis-a-vis big media powerhouses? And my second question was related to the ethics of newspapers and news, basically news outlets. Do you think in a democracy it's ethical or permissible for any particular news channel to be the official spokesperson or the official mouthpiece of a particular political thought or a political party, which we do have to some extent in America, for example. So do you think it's something which would be ethical, and would you be against it or for it? Thank you.
Hello. My question is, I don't know whom I should direct it. I think it is for.
Introduce yourself first.
I'm Rajiv Saxena. I'm doing PhD in the English and Foreign Language Universities. So I want to ask that now, due to economic interests that are prevailing in the media houses have started looking at each other, keeping an eye on each other, that what Ravish is doing is being looked at by Arnab Goswami, what Arnab is doing is being looked at by Ravish. So now, because of the interest, economic interest are involved, so media houses have now started keeping eye on each other. So I want to ask you that how far this has affected the internal ethics of media and how much damage it has done. Other than that, the Web2 technology that has given some way to say the things which otherwise cannot be said have also affected the credibility of the news, because you get the news from variety of sources. So how far that has overall affected the credibility of the news? Thank you. That is what I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Deep, I'm a second year student here. So in the beginning of this question is addressed to the panel as a general, not anyone in particular. So two of the issues which were flagged off were social media and how false opinions are sort of being force-fed or peddled. So in a context where we talk about social media, a case in point being how Facebook, the controversy regarding the whole American presidential election, how certain stories are peddled in a certain manner. So how could this be addressed or regulated either in a legal manner, or to what extent can social media websites be considered as a part of the media as such in this form of discourse?
I'm not a student. My name is Sanjay Gadale. I come in from the city. My question at the moment is addressed to the entire panel. It requires, actually it brings attention to the basic topic that we have at the panel discussion here, censorship and freedom of the press. Now, press is just one of the elements of the entire society, and the very fact that two negative words over here, censorship and withdrawal of freedom, which is what is the intended meaning over here in this entire topic, is talked about for one of the elements or one of the components of society that is made up over here. When the rest of the components, as I think one of the panelists, Mr. Kingshuk Nag, was mentioning about the funding of the political process, which is the basic cause of all the problems that tend to happen over here, is left to go astray and leading to each and every other component actually falling in line and destroying each other in the entire process. How do I address this as a generic social problem, a socio-economic problem per se, and talk about censorship and freedom of the press first after addressing the correction at the social level?
Hello everyone, I'm Shrishti Khare, an LLM student over here. My question is to Siddharth sir. Sir, you talked about the various pressures upon the media, especially the legal pressure. But what about the media exaggeration of the fact, twisting and molding of the facts for the TRPs, and media sitting for the media trials, especially the visual media, sir? Do you think that they should be left aloof and there shouldn't be any fear of the legal action against them?
Can I ask the panelists to respond?
I didn't catch your name. No, not yours. Rohan. Okay. Rohan, your question about the basic rights, whether fundamental or constitutional freedoms that we all enjoy, if they were to be restored in Kashmir, whether that would help the situation. I mean, I would agree with you, but the million-dollar question is that why is it that the policymakers for the last 69 years have not thought along the similar line? And why is it that they still believe that denying or restricting the space or abridging these constitutional freedoms in the name of national security, national interest, terrorism, you name it, ISIS, I mean, whichever most fearful sounding thing that can be invoked, given that it becomes difficult to respond to that question. I mean, I agree with you that restoration of basic rights would definitely help. It does help. We all know that. Civil liberties are very, very important for all of us. And if it were denied to us as it was during emergency, we all know how much we suffer without them. And I'm sure if we were denied that here as people are being denied in so many parts of the country, even as we speak, there's absolutely no question that the basic rights. But the million-dollar question is, why is it not being restored? What is it coming in the way? What are the calculations? What is the thinking? And that's where the problem lies. Therefore, I mean, reconciling, I would like to believe that there is this thing can be reconciled, and the press, that maybe, I keep on hoping, I'm optimist, I keep on hoping that now that this time again, this is in the last 26 years, I don't know what number of time Kashmir is burning, you know, I've forgotten the count of it. At least this time around, having experienced all that has gone in the past, 3 wars, 26 years of military suppression, that somehow we will wake up and realize that these things are not working, that we have to change track, that there has to be a radical change, course correction. I hope that happens, because if that happens, then the possibility of that reconciliation you're speaking about may then become possible, not in its absence.
If I may add to that, I think your question also was regarding the freedom of the press to choose which narrative it wants to portray. Now, at least with respect to Kashmir, I think it's gone beyond a point of portraying just a dominant narrative to having a chokehold on any narrative for discussion. Classic example, there's a loose collective called Karnataka for Kashmir in Bangalore, right? And given the sudden uprise in the number of victims and the whole clampdown that's going on right now, they were planning on organizing a solidarity meeting, again with the prior permission of the police, protesting against the very state, a concept that escapes all logic. And on the day of the solidarity meeting, due to pressure from the RSS, direct threats to the people who were organizing the event, the police permission was revoked. So you have on one hand the freedom of the media to choose a narrative, but you also have an extremely powerful, dominating, strangulating push for just one version of the story. So given that situation, I think it becomes very difficult, at least in conflict zones and reportage around there, to be very picky choosy of which narrative you want to portray. It becomes more of a duty for you to portray all sides of the story. Because if the call is for open discussion, then you need to be equipped with all sides of the story.
If I can just, lots of nice questions, lots of interesting stuff. I'll try to respond to 4 or 5 things. The question by Srishti about, the question by Srishti about the media trials, media exaggeration, should they not fear legal action? Yes, they should. The media freedoms don't exist. The media cannot claim to have freedoms beyond what ordinary citizens have, in the sense that the laws of the land must apply, and civil defamation I'm not for a minute advocating that civil defamation should be done away with. You could even make a case that the process for civil defamation suits need to be streamlined so that it's less difficult to pursue if you're a weaker party compared to, say, a media house. But the criminal defamation is really where the full might of the state is misused. So, and as I said, look at the experience of the last 60 years, where wherever you have laws, those laws are almost never, when it pertains to free speech. It's not the Togadias or the Ovaisis or others who are prosecuted. It takes a lot of protest and noise to get a case registered for hate speech by any one of these gentlemen. But the cases are never followed through. So it is my sense that if we were to, and this also goes to the question people are asking about regulation, that if we create regulations, if we create a regulatory apparatus in the hope that this will curb actual excesses by the media, you will find that these regulations will almost invariably be used not for those excesses, but for cases where people are speaking truth to power or reporting something uncomfortable to those in authority. So I'm much as I hate and abhor the excesses of the media, and they're legion, and there's hardly any meeting that journalists have where, if I'm given a chance to speak, I don't urge that there should be self-regulation and so on. And I know that it's difficult and media houses aren't interested in that. But believe you me, external regulation or reliance on legal mechanisms will produce a far worse outcome than what we have today. And it's not just in India where the application of law is seriously messed up, but even in a country like the UK, which is slightly better off than us, they took, in the aftermath of the phone hacking scandal and the Lewison report, they took regulatory structures up to a certain point, but have stopped short of things that are legally sanctionable. So I would say that we still need to have more robust self-regulation. I would love to have the national broadcasters, the question that Anandita raised. I don't know the particular programs you're talking about, but I can well imagine the way some of these channels behave, and sensationalist, rubbish kind of reporting that they do. It would be good to have them called out by industry bodies, and there are a few examples of that. When Justice Verma was heading the NBSA, we saw some action, but since then things have not really moved in the right way. I'm a fan of creating the institution of a public editor or a reader's editor or an ombudsman. Maybe not through a legal mechanism, but it would be wonderful if every media house were to have an independent internal ombudsman who could serve as an interface between viewer/reader and the editorial department. I'm very happy that we've created such a thing in The Wire, even though we're a very small organization, because we want to have somebody who will be free, independent of us editorially, to whom readers can turn and say, look, we think The Wire is biased about its coverage on XYZ, or The Wire didn't quite follow proper standards in reporting this particular story, and we would like our public editor to adjudicate on that. So I think that it's mechanisms such as this which will be more useful in the long run than creating legal mechanisms for regulation. Media houses keeping an eye, a question that Mr. Saxena asked from FLU. It's true, there is a lot more, media houses are much more willing to be critical of each other. When I joined the profession in '95, there was an unwritten rule that dog doesn't eat dog. Right? So no matter what horrible thing a rival group did, we wouldn't comment on it, or it was not considered fair game. Those barriers have begun to break down somewhat. And we saw, and it's actually been for the good. Like a lot of the exposés of those Kanhaiya, the fake videos that some channels were showing were because other channels wanted to demonstrate to viewers at large how these large channels were actually playing fast and loose with the facts. And so I think this is positive. If the channels are keeping an eye on one another, I think it's for the good. Even if it appears unseemly when they attack each other by name and so on and so forth. But I think to the extent to which people are on their toes, they know they're being watched, and they know that they're being held to account. You know, one of the problems in India is that we don't have a robust system of media criticism. In the US, for example, you have, apart from journalism departments, you have all kinds of private watchdogs that are monitoring the media, calling out media houses when they do something with bias. Fact-checking is very common. Here you have Hoot, the Hoot.org, you have CMS, you have a few institutions that are doing some kind of media watch, but in the main it doesn't exist. So to that extent, it'll be good if we keep an eye out on each other and call out our worst excesses. On the question was asked about the wire, and yeah, I mean, like, we very consciously have are experimenting with a new business model, because as I tried to explain in my analysis, a lot of the problems with the Indian media are linked to the limitations, or I would even say the toxicity of its media model, where you're overly dependent on advertisers in a nutshell, or on other side businesses. The reader is never called upon to pay. Right? So when Kingshuk mentioned that the Times of India costs 25 or 30 rupees to print, but is sold for 4 rupees, there's a problem there. Now, Mr. Sameer Jain always argued that if I didn't keep prices low, the vast expansion in newspaper circulation that we've seen in India would never have happened. And he's right. But I think we've gone a little bit to one extreme, where the price of a daily is less than a cup of tea in a dhaba. So you have, if the reader isn't paying for the news, then somebody else is paying for it. And that person is paying for it with ulterior motives, and is also demanding that the news be molded to suit her or his benefit. So we are saying, can we reimagine the media as a new compact between editorial and the public at large, where the public also is called upon to pay for the news that they consume now. So we've begun to raise money from readers. We've also raised money from public-spirited individuals who have a philanthropic bent of mind and the capacity to donate. But this is all money that comes without strings. And we're quite hopeful that we will be able to grow the wire based on these sources of funding, and eventually create a corpus that would allow us to actually be solvent in perpetuity and free from any kind of corporate or political interference of the kind that's rampant all over the media.
I'd like to add something here. With respect to Hindu, there's something else which has been done. Not only is it priced the highest, which essentially means that it is less competitive, but also they have the concept of the editor's editor. Incredible piece comes in every week by Paneer Selvan, and I actually by chance read it once around a few months back, and I find it is one of the brilliant pieces of journalism and self-regulation that a paper could put on itself to ensure that the quality of the content is maintained and sustained.
There's one question that Mehul raised which I find very interesting, where you asked whether the ethics of newspaper having a political ideology. I don't see anything wrong in that. Almost all newspapers do have. I mean, their editorial policy is very clearly their political ideology, so all the newspapers have it. The question is not whether a newspaper should have a political ideology. I mean, the most conservative papers are the business newspapers, but let me tell you that they have a much better reportage. The business newspapers, conservative, very committed to neoliberalism, but the reportage is far superior to that of daily newspapers. So the two can coexist together. I mean, your commitment to your profession and professional integrity or ethics that you call it doesn't get compromised because you believe in a political ideology. On the contrary, it should actually, there are cases, I mean, EPW is a classic example, we have always been left. But that has not meant that it has sacrificed its integrity, its commitment to truthfulness of fact. It can be done. There is nothing which says that it can't be done. It can be done. The question is, how do you do it without imposing your own view and censoring other person? I mean, that's also the responsibility of the media and the people who occupy the media positions. And just one thing on self-regulation. I am a firm believer in media self-regulating itself for a very simple reason. Because this giving the state any opportunity to censor or to act as a regulator is a slippery slope. It doesn't stop with just one thing. It's a slippery slope and you can go down very far. So it's better that media self-regulate. But the trouble is that the electronic media and the NBSA is in fact a classic example of a mechanism that has been set up which is not working. Lot of people have lot of problems. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. Times now had the habit of every time there was some terrorist thing and some human rights activist had to be lampooned or hammered, they would put up pictures. And they used to put up my picture also, saying that there's a terrorist supporter and lover, along with traitor like, Gilani or others that you can name. Now the point is, it didn't matter to me because when the Times of India reporter called me, I said, please tell Arnab that he's a very good friend of mine because he's trying to turn a zero that I am into a hero unnecessarily. But if he wants to do it, he's very welcome and I really appreciate what he's trying to do. So there are ways of dealing with these shameless characters also. And law is not the only means. Taking a mob and attacking is not the only means. Saying that somebody should take this on, this person on and things like that is not the only means. There are other ways in which, and therefore we have to become more imaginative also. And that is also the challenge for the media. That how do you, in this constraint in which you're working, you're occupying a newspaper which is owned by a corporate house and you are running a newspaper and the challenge is with you. To see how you can negotiate yourself and mediate your way between your professional commitment and the constraint under which you're working and how do you try and do it. It can be done. It's not impossible. People have done it. It's not something that one has to invent. It can be done. But very often people choose not to do it because it's so much simpler. If you're drawing a fat salary, to not bother about getting your life disturbed by these unnecessary diversions. So, I mean, a lot depends also from the professionals in the media to rise up to the occasion when there are challenges to be met. Can I say something? There's a remarkable article that came after the Charlie Hebdo incident. Now, all of you are familiar with what happened in Charlie Hebdo and the hypocrisy of the French state and the French intelligentsia. One day shouting for freedom of press and expression, and within 24 hours when the French parliament passed the emergency law which curbed freedoms, there was not a squeak. But there was a remarkable piece that was written by Norman Finkelstein, where he critiqued the Charlie Hebdo cartoon by saying that this was not satire. It was not satire, it was sadism. Why? And he said satire is one, and I quote, satire is one when directs it either at oneself, causes his or her people to think twice about what they are doing and saying, or directs it at people who have power and privilege, unquote. Finkelstein then compared, and then he goes on to say that to use fighting words, we use hate speech is the term we use. I think hate speech is very disturbing. I don't believe in anything called hate speech, because tomorrow if the workers cry down with capitalism and down with capitalism, we'll declare that that's hate speech. So I'm very wary of hate speech proponents. Fighting words, yes, exactly as the Supreme Court of India does. They say there is a difference between advocacy and incitement. I can be an advocate of violence and a violent overthrow, but I can't be hauled up for that advocacy. I can be hauled up for inciting violence. There is a difference. So I think keeping these things in mind and realizing that sadism is directed at those who are vulnerable, who are weak, who are underprivileged or disprivileged, as the French Muslims were, it becomes necessary for us to also say. That doesn't mean therefore those guys have the right to go and shoot anybody. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that there are moments when we believe that this is freedom of expression. When somebody is talking about the Muslim personal law and talking about Muslim women's rights in this day and age, forgetting that the majority of Hindi women suffer from denial of rights. There is no other personal code in this country which gives tax benefits to a religious group as the Hindu Undivided Family Property Act does, HUF does. No, it's a clear tax benefit that is extended to the Hindus. We don't talk about that. We talk about UCC. We don't have common criminal law in this country. So why talk about common civil law? My point is that the media doesn't take up these issues also, which are very important, because this can generate a debate, make us conscious about the weaknesses, shortcomings of the system, be aware of what is going wrong, etc., etc. But I thought that this is very important to keep in mind, but very often we defend in the name of freedom of expression the most obnoxious things because we believe in it. I mean, we can be critical of that, at the same time defending the right of the person even to obnoxious views. I mean, if Mr. Praveen Togadia wants to say that this XYZ should be killed, I mean, as he did on 1st March 2002, as the Gujarat massacre was going on Zee TV, he came out and advocated that this should carry on. Nothing happened to him. He was using fighting words. This was in the middle of genocide that was taking place. And he said it, no action was taken. But if I were to stand up, or any one of us were to stand up and say that yes, the Adivasis have a right to pick up weapons and fight against the Indian state, if it doesn't give heed to their concern, then I can be hauled up for waging war or advocating waging war against the state. So these dichotomies, these contradictions, these the lack of equality before law that exists in the country, and that the fact and the reality that there is no criminal law which is common to all. The right wing can get away with anything, others can't. The security forces and government officials can get away with anything. The law will not touch them, as it doesn't touch them in armed forces, where the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and the army enjoys legal immunity. So there are a lot of problems that we are talking about. There are a lot of problems we are talking about that are interlinked. And it's linked to freedom of expression, because freedom of press cannot be separated from freedom of expression of each and every one of us.
So friends, we come to the close of what has evidently been a very thought-provoking session. Thanks to all the participants and the panelists for giving us such an exhilarating afternoon.